Nearly 2 years ago, I reviewed a game called Sundered, a Metroidvania from the creators of Jotun, Jotun, with a specific gimmick of procedurally generated labyrinths and a Final Fantasy X or Path of Exile styled level up system. To appreciate this video, I'm not going to require you to have watched the first review, but let's just say that in that video I was not very kind to Sundered. And now, 2 years later, it's an opinion that I stand by and will defend to my grave. I know a lot of people had issue with the fact that I only played about 5 hours of Sundered before I put my review out, and to a lot of people, I think that's considered a bit of a cardinal sin when it comes to judging a game, especially as a YouTuber and as a content creator. But the way that I see it, if I'm not having fun with a game, especially after 5 hours in, I'm entitled to my judgment. Anybody is entitled to their judgment, no matter how long they've played the game. And as long as the person judging the game makes it clear how long that they played and that they didn't finish the game, then I personally don't see any problem with putting the opinion out there. The opinion of somebody who quit 5 hours into the game because they were having a terrible time is just as valuable an opinion as somebody who put in the time to complete it 100% or even just beat it. Because at the end of the day, what are we judging? We're judging whether or not the game is fun, or worth your time, or worth a specific arbitrary amount of value. So again, I don't see the problem. But I'm not making this video to talk about reviewing games, and I could probably spend a whole video talking about that specific idea, but this isn't a video about that. This is a video about Sundered. 2 years ago when I reviewed Sundered, I was pretty harsh. There wasn't much that I liked about the game. I absolutely despised the procedurally generated world. I thought that the combat suffered a lot due to the way the enemies were designed, and I thought that the level up system was poorly balanced and ended up creating a lot of monotony instead of a lot of fun. But something interesting about being a YouTuber and putting your opinion out for the world to see is that people with opposing opinions can look at the video or look at the content that's created and give their own input. And people did. There were a lot of people who wrote comments on my Sundered video telling me that I was playing it wrong, or that I didn't have any right to judge the game after only 5 hours, or that I was stupid because they loved the game and thought it was fantastic. There were some toxic comments, but there were even more reasonable comments telling me that they really enjoyed the game and that I should give it another chance. And for some reason, the amount of people that really enjoyed Sundered kind of won me over. So I decided to play through Sundered again and see if my opinion of the game had changed at all. This time as I played Sundered, I decided that I was going to beat it, and I did. After about 9 or 10 hours taking the resist path, I finally beat the game. But after having beaten Sundered, I can't say that my opinion of the game is really that much better than when I went into it to begin with. There have been a significant number of changes to the game. The first significant change that I noticed was the fact that there is now a finisher that you unlock immediately as you get your weapon. This finisher move does a lot of damage, and it charges up as you deal damage to your enemies and as you target things around the terrain. Once your finisher charge is full, you can simply hit a button to unleash it. And depending on the direction that you're holding when you fire it off, and whether or not you're in the air, something different can happen. More often than not, I opted for the neutral air finisher just because it had a nice wide area of effect and it did a lot of damage. But this addition alone made the combat a lot more palatable for me because it gave me more choices than just spamming my attack button. The second big change that I noticed, and I'm actually not sure if this is really a change or if this is something that I just completely happened to miss in my first play of the game, but you're able to destroy the Elder Shards that you get throughout the game. As you destroy the shards, you get a little bit of currency, but you also unlock a few extra upgrade pips on your upgrade tree below the perk slot. At least I think that's what is unlocking those. I don't recall ever seeing this ability to burn the Elder Shards, but it was nice to be able to be rewarded for my choice to resist. And as far as the changes go, I think that's it. It did feel like I was being more rewarded for playing the game. Like, I felt like I was getting more shards and more experience points, currency to spend in my level up tree. So overall, going through the game, I felt like I was much more powerful this time around than I was last time. But perhaps I was just better at the game at this point than I was last time. It's hard for me to say. But even with these changes, and even though my experience was a little bit better, overall, I still think Sundered suffers from some very core design choices that I don't really feel like fit in a good Metroidvania game. One of my biggest complaints the first time around was that the world was very boring, and all of the pretty, beautiful art in the world isn't going to change that. Sundered looks absolutely incredible. The art style is amazing, and the animations flow so beautifully. But when you're going through the same 3 or 4 or 5 different little rooms that create the procedurally generated labyrinth on your way from point A to point B, you can't help but just not care. For me, one of the biggest and most rewarding aspects of a Metroidvania is to be able to explore a world that's created with intent from the designers, a world that is deliberately hiding some nice little upgrades just around the corner behind a clever little puzzle or a clever little hidden passageway or something like that. A world that rewards you for exploring it and memorizing it and learning some specific landmarks as you traverse through it. I'd be lying if I said that Sundered didn't reward exploration at all, because that's not true. Sundered does reward exploration. The world, for all of its procedurally generated aspects, does have some elements of static and deliberate design to it. There are a bunch of static rooms on the map that will never change their location, and the general path from point A to point B will always be the same, even if the rooms that make up that path from point A to point B wind up being different. You can see where you've been and where you haven't, and if you decide to go somewhere where you haven't, you just might find a nice little upgrade or a perk or an extra amount of currency or, something maybe a little bit interesting. But what is missing is the ability to recognize exactly where you are based off of specific landmarks on the specific hallway you're going through. You could take just about any of the popular Metroidvania titles today, and you could show somebody who really loves that game one of the rooms, and they could tell you just about exactly where it's at, or what it's close to, or what it's on the way to. My point is that each hallway and each room, no matter how small or insignificant, has a meaning, and it has a purpose, and it can wind up being memorable on its own, even if it's just a stupid little hallway that takes you from point A to point B. That hallway can wind up being memorable in some way just because it's unique. And unfortunately, the need to procedurally generate the hallways and the labyrinths from point A to point B in Sundered take the wind out of exploring it. Very quickly, I ended up with what I call Diablo syndrome, in which I'm looking at the minimap for my next destination more than I'm actually looking at my character or at the world around me. There's really no reason to look at the world around you, especially if you're trying to navigate relatively quickly. You're looking for the next doorway to the next area, and anything else is just unimportant. So that's the exploration side of things, which is arguably not Sundered's main focus. What Sundered cares about more than exploration is combat, but while the combat in general feels good, it's responsive and you can press buttons and your character will do exactly what you ask without any finickiness or any ambiguity or anything that's going to confuse you. The combat system is relatively straightforward, and in a lot of ways it feels like the combat system from a Super Smash Bros. Game. But even though the combat feels good and responsive most of the time, the enemies around that combat and the world that the enemies inhabit just completely take away any enjoyment that I had in this combat. Enemies constantly fly through walls to avoid you, and there's not really anything that you can do to combat that. These same enemies that are flying into the walls are also going to be shooting at you from within the walls, and the bullets cannot be stopped by the terrain. This really isn't a very fun mechanic, in my opinion. I really don't think this is a very good choice for monsters, especially in a fast-moving, combat-focused Metroidvania title. More often than not, the world feels like it's in your way rather than helping you dodge and weave or avoid projectiles. It would have been really cool to be able to use the environment as cover from these flying enemies. But the flying enemies are just a single example on their own. By themselves, they're not really a huge deal, and they're not really something that make me hate the combat. It's pretty much everything that's put together. It's everything. You take the whole composition, and that's what makes it bad. You have all of these different kinds of enemies, which by themselves might be all right, but when you take their jankiness next to the jankiness of every other enemy in the game, you can't help but feel like it just becomes not fun. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way that the game tries to make you feel overwhelmed by sending hordes and hordes of these enemies at you. And while it can sometimes feel pretty good to mow down a dozen or half a dozen of these enemies at the same time with a well-placed and well-timed combo, more often than not, it just turns into a cluttered visual mess that would give the chaos of Battleborn a run for its money. And the cherry on top of this is when you finally unlock one of the very last upgrades in the game, the grappling hook. This item is supposed to let you move around much more freely because there's grappling hook points in many parts of the world, and you're also able to grappling hook onto enemies to help you move around. In fact, the last two bosses focus on this heavily, with a lot of air combat required to be able to even fight with them or do damage. The final boss in particular has a lot of grappling points that you're supposed to use to climb up to its high point and deal damage to its weak spot. But while on paper that seems like a good idea, it's so hard to control this grappling hook. And it's not hard in a Kaizo Mario, easy to learn, challenging to master kind of way. It's hard in a, I didn't really want to do that, you stupid grappling hook, why am I going this way? I wanted to go the other way kind of way. The final two bosses of this game focus on the grappling hook extensively. And in a game where I was already getting sick of the enemy spam and too much garbage on the screen at once, having the grappling hook do the opposite of what I wanted when I'm in the midst of a heated combat or a heated fight just made everything so much worse. At the end of the day, I still can't recommend Sundered to anybody. There's too many things that I don't think fit very well in a Metroidvania game. And even if we take the exploration aspect and don't judge it based on that, the combat by itself isn't enough to justify picking this up, except maybe on a deep sale. That said, I can see why people enjoy it. There's a lot to do, there's a lot to unlock. The level up tree is really interesting, even if I feel like some of the upgrades should be unlocked automatically, like the ability to attack and destroy bullets. I mean, really, why is that hidden on the upgrade tree? You should really be given that as you're adventuring. It feels way too important. But there's a lot to do, there's a lot to unlock, and there's a lot of end-game challenges on top of everything else, so that if you were enjoying Sundered, there's a lot more for you to do. So, those of you who told me I was wrong, I get it, but I still don't like Sundered. Revisiting this game is something I've been wanting to do for a while just because of how much people were defending this game from my review of it. And I'm glad that I did. And I can at least say that my experience this time around was far better than it was the first time around. Regardless of my opinions on Sundered, I'm actually really interested to see what this development studio will come up with next for their next project. They obviously have a lot of talent behind them, especially in the visual design department. I feel like it's just a matter of time until they come up with something truly great, without having to rely on gimmicks like procedural generation in a genre that traditionally houses deliberately designed worlds for its players to explore. So we'll have to see what the future holds for them. But for now, I've said my piece on Sundered, and I hope you enjoyed this video, even though there's not really much new information from me here. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.